Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at the important web.xml file, and we're going to need to know about this before we go on to looking at deploying web applications on the internet and on local machines. So let's start a new project in Eclipse here. So now this is actually a quite recent version of Eclipse, at least at the moment. This is Eclipse Juno, and I'm just going to go to File, New, and I'm going to go to Dynamic Web Project, and let's just call this Temp, because I'm not going to keep this. In fact, I've already got a project called Temp. Let's call it Temp1, that'll do. And now if I go through this wizard screen here, and now I'm going to click Generate Web.xml Deployment Descriptor, and if you're using an older version of Eclipse, or perhaps even a newer version, you might not have that checkbox, and if you don't have it, then Eclipse is going to create a Web.xml for you anyway by default, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you do see that checkbox, then certainly tick it, and I'll click Finish here. Now the funny thing is about recent versions of Eclipse is that if I now do new servlet here, let's go to new servlet and just call this temp, let's call it test. Actually that's the package, so I'll put it in a package called demo, and I'll give it a class name of test. Now if I create this servlet, so my servlet will be in here in Java resources in this source folder in the demo package, and when you run this servlet, what happens is, let's say always use this server when running this project, and go forward and finish. What happens is there's going to be a URL that maps to that servlet. So here I am running the servlet, and the URL /temp1, we call this bit of the URL the context root, followed by slash and the server and the servlet name. In this case is the URL by which I can access the servlet. Now by default in this version of Eclipse, that URL is actually mapped in the Java source file itself. So if I click on this Java here, you can see there's this annotation that specifies what URL the servlet runs on. And there's a problem with this, which is that at the moment at least, most application servers, as far as I know, will not take any notice of that. So we don't really want to use that mechanism, and I'm not going to use it in these tutorials. So what I suggest is the following. I'm going to delete this project for a start, and let's say delete project contents as well, because I don't want to keep this. And I'm going to create a new project here. Let's go to new dynamic web project, wherever that is. Here we go, and I'll call this, let's call it deployment will do actually. Now if you're using an older version of Eclipse, or if this has perhaps been changed in subsequent versions, then you're fine. But if you're using a version of Eclipse that looks like this, you see here it says dynamic web module version, and I'm going to change that to an older version. I'm going to go to 2.5, because 2.5 uses a traditional web.xml file, and it's the web.xml file that we're going to look at in this tutorial. So let's click next, and everything else is fine. I'm going to make sure I tick generate web.xml deployment descriptor. And again, in older versions of Eclipse, you didn't have to do that because it was the default. And I'll click Finish. And by the way, this is the context root, so that's the stem of the URL that it's going to run on. And I'll click Finish here. And now let's add a new servlet to this. So I'll right click and I'll go to New Servlet here. And let's put this servlet in a package called demo, and I'll call it hello, which will do. And I can accept the defaults here and just go through this wizard, and that's all fine. So I'm going to give it a do get method, click Finish, And just so that you can see that this is actually doing something, let's just say here print writer out equals new print writer. We saw this in an earlier tutorial, a couple of tutorials ago, and oh sorry, not new print writer, I actually need to do response.get writer. There we go. And now I'm going to use that writer just to write some output, and in fact I won't even bother with normal HTML here. I'll just say out.write println hello, because that will at least get us some visible output. And now I'm going to run that, and it's going to look pretty much the same as last time. Let's just tick always use this server when running this project. Click finish. So hello.java is going to run on this URL. Here's the context root, just here, and this of course is my domain name, which is going to change when I deploy this to the internet, which I'm going to do possibly in the next tutorial or the one after that. And here's the servlet URL mapping. Now that URL mapping is controlled by a file which you can find under your web content folder in this webinf subfolder, and it's this web.xml file. And if I right click on that and go to open with text editor, we can see what it actually looks like when you view it as a text file. And you can see that in older versions of Eclipse and in this version of Eclipse, providing you do what I just did and you select the 2.5 web module version, when you add a servlet you automatically get this bit added to your web.xml. So this bit here is actually controlling what files can act as welcome files. So if I create an index.jsp, for example, then that's going to be like the home page for my project, because index.jsp is in here. In fact, let's just do that now just to demonstrate. If I go to new JSP file, index.jsp, click finish, and just put hello from index.jsp, and save that and just run it. So I'll click on it here, and it's very important that this should reside directly under your web content folder, so don't accidentally put it in webinf or anything, and then run this. We're going to see hello from index.jsp. Let's go back to web.xml now, and so you see that for because this is one of these files listed here, if I run it, then I can just actually go to the root of my web application here. I can get rid of the index.jsp and just go to the context root here, hit return, and I'm still seeing that index.jsp file, and that's because in web.xml it's listed as one of these possible welcome files. Now more importantly for our purposes here is the servlet mapping stuff, because this controls where your servlet, what URL your servlet is going to run on. And if you look closely, I've got a servlet here. Actually, description and display name are not really important. We could even get rid of those and it won't make any difference. But what's important is that we should have a servlet tag, so that opens there and closes here, and a servlet mapping tag which opens there and closes here for every servlet. And you can also add them for JSPs, as we'll see in a minute. Now under the servlet tag here, you need to give the servlet a name, and that needs to match the name here, I think. And you also need to say within the servlet tag you need to have a servlet-class, which specifies the class to run for this servlet. So the servlet's hello.java, ultimately hello.class within the demo package. So I call it demo.hello in the servlet class tag. Let's just take a look at that. So there's my demo package with the hello.java in it. And then to control the URL, you have the servlet mapping, and in there you have to specify the URL pattern. And you can see here it's saying that the servlet called hello will map to the URL /hello. And if I change that, for example, to, let's change it to hello world, and let's run this again. So save it, and I need to select the file I want to run. I'll run this hello.java and click run. and now it's running on the URL /hello world relative to the context root. If you do as I suggested and you either use an older version of Eclipse or you select that 2.5 module version, you won't have to worry about this web.xml. But you need to make sure that these mappings are here, because if they're not here, then when you deploy your application to an app server of some kind, an application server on the internet somewhere, it probably won't work unless you have this XML stuff correct. So it's important to at least check that and at least consider it and think about it. And the whole point of this web.xml really is to deploy your application in the correct way. And this is how you map servlets. And if you have a JSP file and you want to map that to a URL, it's pretty simple. So let's just take a look at that. And I'll create under web content, I will create a new JSP file, and let's call it hello. In fact, I won't call it hello, I'll call it something different just for a change. Let's call it something like, I don't know, login.jsp. You can imagine that this is a login page. And just go through this, and that's all fine. And now, so if I run this by default, it's just gonna be blank. I could put some text in here. Let's say this could be a login page, and just run it again so we can see that text there. And sometimes I find that if you find that your page doesn't display, try hitting the refresh button, and if it still doesn't work, go to project clean and then build it again, and clean will just clean out your old class files. But that seems to have worked. Let's just quit that. Now let's take a look at web.xml. So there's not actually a mapping in there for my JSP file, but you can have one if you want. And let's just copy this. So we need the same tags again basically, except that instead of having where are we? So we've got a servlet class here under servlet. Yeah, so that's my old mapping. I don't want to change that. And the servlet mapping bit is going to be the same, except I need to customize it, of course. So let's call this let's call this login. So I'll type login for a name here. And part of the reason this is so similar to this is that servlets, JSPs get compiled to servlets, as we saw in a previous tutorial. But there's just going to be one little change. So we'll give it the name login, and let's say that the URL pattern is going to be /login page, for example. And now instead of servlet class, I need to say in here JSP-file. So I'll say JSP-file and close JSP-file. And my file here is start it with a slash, and then let's say index.jsp, login.jsp, which is the JSP file down here that I want to map. So everything apart from that is the same as the servlet mapping. And let's save that. And now let's just select login.jsp and run that and see what we get. So I should be able to access that via the URL /login page, as indeed I can. So that's it for this tutorial. You probably won't need to mess with this web.xml unless you want to customize your URLs. But as I say, when you deploy your application, this is going to have to be there. So you need to check that Eclipse has generated it correctly, and if not, you're going to have to add it in yourself and add in the mappings that you want. So that's it for this tutorial, and in the next tutorial we're going to start looking at how to deploy this web application, and we're going to start by just deploying it to Tomcat on our local machine, and then we're going to look at deploying it to the internet using a free account. So join me again next time, and until next time, happy coding.